Welcome back, everyone. This is a continuation of our conversation about evolution and, in particular, human variation. And so I wanted to kind of drill down on some of the ideas that we briefly covered before in the last lecture on this, and to bring up some of the kind of issues and problems that we see, the complications, if you will, in human evolution. So as I mentioned last time, there are these four evolutionary processes, and again, they're not the only four evolutionary processes. There's many others, things like sexual selection and stuff like that, which we'll talk about later. But I did want to talk about these again, just because I usually find that students still have a few questions on them, even after reading about them in the book. And so one of the things is that I want to talk about is gene flow versus genetic drift, right? Gene flow is really migration, okay? And so I want to use something other than humans just to demonstrate what I was talking about here. So let's say that somebody from population A goes over to population B. Well, these are moths, and they obviously have a proportion of red alleles and orange alleles. If you look, population A has 2 red allele moths versus 4 orange allele moths. Population B is the inverse with 4 red and 2 orange. But if if we have a migration from population A to population B, that has now changed the potential genetic expression of that group, right? Through randomness, just through chance, okay? So absolutely. Genetic drift is another one that I want to talk about. So using these same moths here, let's say that we've got, a population of 1,000 versus a population of 10, but that they're equally split, right? The red versus orange alleles are 50-50. Now let's say that you have a school bus driving along and it hits 5 red moths randomly, right, from population A. And let's say it just randomly hits 5 red moths from population B. When we go back to look at our population, the population size in population A has gone from 1,000 to 995, and it's barely impacted it. The proportion of red allele is still 49.7%. My screen is covering up on the other side, but it doesn't take a math whiz to figure out if 5 out of the population of 10 were red, and by chance, those were the 5 that got hit by a bus, that particular allele no longer exists in that population. It's completely gone, right? And so that's another example of how this sort of functions, right? So genetic drift represents random changes in gene frequency from one generation to the next because of disaster, because of disease, because of any of these things, right? There can also be 2 different things, right? There can be what's called the bottleneck effect, which is a kind of genetic drift population are suddenly really reduced in size, like our school bus, right? You can also have the founder effect that I talked about before, where like this small subgroup from a larger population kind of goes off and becomes isolated. Well, what the genetics are in that population is utterly random as to who's going to be moving to a new area. And so you may end up with underrepresented proportions of certain alleles in that group, okay? So one of the things that I have students ask a lot is, can we predict the future of human evolution, right? The truth is we really can't, because are we still evolving? Yes, we're going to talk about that when we talk about things like wisdom teeth and stuff. However, genetics and biology is not the only way that you and I adapt anymore. 1,000,000 years ago, if the Earth became radically colder overnight for whatever geologic reason, those organisms that say have more hair or store more fat or those kinds of things would be the ones that are going to make it in that new world of extreme cold. You and I don't have that. If it got suddenly cold out today, would those of us with more hair and more body fat live, and those who are sort of hairless and skinny die? No, we'd put on a coat, right? We'd turn the thermostat up. We have cultural tools that allow us to adapt to our environment now. It's why we're able to live literally everywhere in the world. No organism has the range that we do. No organism lives in as many places as we do. You've probably heard people like, oh, rats or cockroaches or stuff. Those organisms can't live in nearly the number of places that we can. A lot of times those organisms can only live in as wide a range as they do because they live in our homes because they live in things that we have created culturally to adapt to our environment, and they just kind of piggyback along with it, right? We live in the Atacama Desert and the Arctic Circle, and so, it's because of culture that we can do a lot of these things. And so it is difficult for us. I mean, hell, we live in space now, right? People have spent literally years living in outer space through cultural means. That's a cultural environment, right? And so it's really, really difficult for us to honestly, like, whenever somebody says, oh, this is what people are going to look like in a few, we really don't know what's going to happen. There's just too many variables there. And there's just, we're absolutely still subjected to evolutionary processes. And so there are things that we can argue are trends that we might see in our evolution. But the truth is, it's too complex for us to really make a stand on that. Last time we were talking about this modern evolutionary synthesis, right, that helped undermine the biological race concept, right, and that recognizes human beings as a single species, right? But I wanted to talk about that a little bit because what is a species, all right? Believe it or not, that's a tougher question to answer than you might believe, right? Neo-Darwinism defined a species in terms of population, right? The population of organisms. But there's different concepts around this. So the biological species concept, which is the one that we mostly have used, and you still find it in the biological sciences, right? Their criteria for what is a species is that species are reproductively isolated from other species, right? Meaning that species cannot produce fertile offspring if interbred with a different species, right? So this is why we talk about breeds of dog, but that we recognize golden retrievers are not a different species than labs or something like that, right? Because they can interbreed with each other. Yeah, they look different. And again, that's not natural selection, that's artificial selection of us breeding animals, but you get my point. And so we've always said, you can't have, if you can produce viable offspring with each other, then you're one species, right? And that those species occupy a specific niche in nature. But one of the things that I always like to emphasize is the fact that nature did not get our memo. There's a lot of ways in which we classify things that doesn't always work, or the way that we define things that works most of the time, but except in this situation. And a great example of this is mules, right? Mules are the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Okay. And interestingly enough, like, you can even see this, like, there's you can see it in them, but also in the chromosomes. Horses have 64 chromosomes. Donkeys have 62 chromosomes, right? So 64 and 62. Mules, their offspring, have 63, right? So right in the middle between them. Now, they are different species, which is why they, as it says there, species cannot produce fertile offspring. Not that they can't necessarily produce offspring, but they can't produce fertile offspring. Mules don't make more mules, okay? Mules are infertile. They cannot have offspring. They're completely sterile. Only horses and donkeys make mules. Except they actually have, right? There have been 60 documented cases in the world, which is very, very slim compared to, I'm talking about millions and millions of births here. There have been 60 mules in the world that it has been documented that they were capable of producing offspring on their own, right? That they are in fact fertile, right? And so this works really, really well. But again, nature didn't get that memo, and they are, happy. It happens, right? I don't want to do a Jeff Goldblum here, but nature finds a way, right? That's just the reality of it, So another one is the phylogenetic species concept, right? Which came out of some of these issues with biological species concept, because the phylogenetic species concept it recognizes that crossbreeding and hybridization happens, right? And so that maybe rather than talking about breeding and fertility, we should talk about species based on particular and unique morphological or maybe genetic features that kind of distinguish it from others, right? This concept is used a lot by paleoanthropologists that study our deep history, going back millions of years. And so hybridization includes things like ligers, right, which is the offspring of a male lion and a female tiger, or tigons, which is a female lion and a male tiger, right? And also it demonstrates that idea of hybridization that I talked about with hybrid vigor. If you remember, that's sort of the opposite of inbreeding, to put it in really simplistic terms. And this is a good example of this. These guys are absolutely massive. Ligers are significantly bigger than either lions or tigers. It is this really huge animal, which would be absolutely terrifying if you ran across one, right? And these have actually been interbred with each other. Again, there's not a ton of them in the world because this really only happens when they are around each other in zoos and stuff. And so there have been ligers and tigons that have been interbred with each other, and things like that. I mean, there's all this crazy stuff out there, but nonetheless, right, it shows that there is hybridization, that the species concept is not quite so narrow as we sometimes think of, right? And the last one that I want to talk about really briefly is the phonetic fossil species concept, whereby users first calculate morphological differences between a living species. So maybe if we're trying to study this extinct version of a horse that was, or a horse-like, ungulate that was in the Americas before humans got here, we'd look at other species in the range that they have now, or we'd look at us as a species, human beings, and sort of look at it, right? And the assumption is that there is a similar degrees of morphological difference to distinguish these different species in the fossil record. It allows fossils to be sorted that are in a continuously changing lineage. This does have some issues, though, because sometimes one species can have a tremendous range. So, I mean, you're talking about, like, look at human beings, right? You have NBA players, and you have people who are 4'10", 4'11". Usually when I'm in the classroom, I'll ask students, how tall are you? And I usually have somebody that's 6'4", 6'5", and I usually have somebody that's 4'11" or 5 foot, right? That's a huge range. And a lot of time, that's such a range that in the fossil record, we would look at those two things and go, this is double its size. Of course, that's a different species than that thing is over there. This is half that size. This is a new species compared to that one, right? And so it does have some issues, but given the constraints of having extinct species and potentially limited numbers of fossils to look at when you're talking about something that is 4, 6, 10, 12 million years old, it's really necessary to do this. Morphology is the only thing that we're going to be able to sort of sort that on. Okay. So thank you guys very much. I will talk to you next time.